Hopefully everyone can see. Alright, my laptop is kind of covering my phone, so hopefully nobody messages anything. Oh. Hope everyone's having a happy Wednesday. Good morning, Michael. Hope you're doing well. Good morning, Christina. All right, I'm just going to get started, and then people can join as they please. So my name is Analies, and I'm Hydroviv's head of policy. Today, I'm going to be talking about something that is one of my favorite topics. It's called SuperFund. And when I was getting my master's at UW, this was something that we talked about quite frequently because it is such an important environmental statute. So today's kind of going to be like a crash course. And hopefully there won't be too much legal jargon or, complicated things. It's just going to be a very broad overview of what SuperFund is, and why it's important and how it relates to drinking water. So SuperFund, also known as the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, CERCLA, but I'm just going to refer to it as SuperFund. So SuperFund was created in the 80s to address hazardous pollution from factories or industries that had largely gone unregulated. It was just kind of the first check and balance on chemical companies and industries in the U.S. So prior to 1980, when SuperFund was enacted, there wasn't really any form of accountability on polluters. And the 70s and 80s were really when the years and decades of ignoring the environment kind of came to a head. This was the time when America's rivers were the most polluted that they've ever been. I mean, rivers were literally being lit on fire. I don't know if anyone on this live has seen the movie A Civil Action, but it talks about a town in Massachusetts called Woburn, Massachusetts, and there was a cancer cluster of leukemia. And the river that the folks in Woburn were drinking from was catching on fire because it was so polluted. So this was kind of a time when it was, all right, we need to do something to clean up America's waterways and the environment in general. So all of these previous statutes before SuperFund were really state specific, and they were very sparse, so they were far and few between. But all of the statutes prior to SuperFund only dealt with new waste. So anything like retroactively that had happened in the past, like decades of waste, there wasn't really anything to address old pollution. So EPA started to discover that these certain sites across the country had been contaminated for decades. And that a majority of these companies that were responsible for the pollution had either gone out of business, had been dissolved, they had been bought by another company, or they simply just couldn't be found. So EPA just couldn't locate these companies that were responsible for pollution that happened decades ago. So, the best example of this would be, let's say, a tannery in New York State. It was in operation in the 50s. And let's just say the owners passed away, and then, no one is really responsible for that pollution. So who then pays to clean up that site that there's no one who you can kind of put liability on? Who pays for that? So that is the root of SuperFund, is that it's a fund for, places that they can't identify who's liable, but it still needs to be addressed and it still needs to be cleaned up. So this is kind of important. So SuperFund does not make contamination illegal. especially for unregulated contaminants. It just makes polluters responsible for the cost to clean it up. So SuperFund doesn't say, oh, you can't dump perchlorate into this injection well. It just says, if that pollution becomes a problem or you are deemed by your state as a Superfund site, then you need to pay to clean it up. So that's just kind of an important stipulation on Superfund. So the Superfund itself was actually a tax, and it wasn't a tax on the average American citizen, but it was a tax on chemical and petroleum companies. So in just 5 years, $1.6 billion was collected from the Superfund tax. And this was able to provide broad federal authority to respond directly to hazardous waste and hazardous spills. So unfortunately, this is kind of one of the nuances and flaws of Superfund. So the way that the statute was set up required reauthorization from Congress every few years. So in 1995, Congress allowed this taxing authority to actually lapse, meaning that the chemical and petroleum companies, were off the hook for funding Superfund completely because the tax was no longer being applied to chemical and petroleum companies. So now what? The taxes no longer exist. So who's paying for Superfund? Who's paying for this program that was doing so well to clean up the environment? So according to a 2015 report from the Government Accountability Office, 80% of the funds from Superfund come from American taxpayers. So this makes no sense whatsoever, right? Because the American taxpayers are not the ones who are dumping chemicals and hazardous waste into riverways or waterways and rivers and groundwater and soil. The American people are not the ones doing that. It's the chemical and petroleum companies. So this is where it's a little bit mind-blowing that now the burden is on us to pay for things that these big multi-billion-dollar conglomerates are doing. So yeah, this is definitely one of the biggest flaws of Superfund, and the reauthorization for the Superfund tax has not been reapplied to chemical and petroleum companies since 1995. So one of the other flaws to Superfund is that not all hazardous sites, so not all closed factories or tanneries or things like that, are accounted for under the Superfund program. So there are plenty of sites out there that aren't designated by EPA as a Superfund site. And that's because states are required to make a national priorities list. And so this list is the states saying, all right, we need this site taken care of first. And then from there, they're kind of prioritizing what they believe to be kind of the worst case sites, things that need to be addressed now. And then from that, EPA will determine who gets funding, how much funding. So not all of these sites are being addressed. That's the other biggest flaw. Another flaw is just the timeline of this. So it can take 10 years, start to finish, from a EPA Superfund site being designated and the completion of remediation. So that's a long period of time. I mean, if you are, I'll get into this in a second, but if you're on a private well and you don't even know that the site is being designated as a Superfund site, and it takes 10 years, that's 10 years of you potentially drinking contaminated water and, it not being remediated by the federal government. So on that note, how does this apply to drinking water, which is really why we're here? So chemical and hazardous waste affect both municipal tap water and private wells. So it doesn't really, it doesn't only affect, one type, which some of you might presume would be private wells. So because this program is so underfunded and not as all-encompassing as it was initially intended to be, there are a lot of gaps in how drinking water is protected in relation to SuperFund. So like I was talking about with the national priorities list, if there's a site that's at the bottom of the list that maybe is near a tributary to the source water for a municipality, then that site won't be addressed for a while, or it'll take 10 plus years for it to be addressed. And this is particularly concerning for those thousands of unregulated contaminants that SuperFund might not be considering right now, or might not be considering for several years. So this is a really important thing to take into consideration, is that there are all these external factors and things that aren't being considered by EPA that could go into the quality of a waterway that's then eventually going to be used for drinking water. That being said, private wells are by far the most susceptible to SuperFund sites and the impact that pollution can have. So private wells are unique from the public supply because they're actually unregulated. And that means that a private well owner doesn't have the state or the federal government to rely on to determine if their well is safe or not. What they have to determine is their own tests, which typically only test for 5 contaminants. So they're really on their own for determining the safety of their water. And this can be really problematic if someone lives nearby a SuperFund site. Just because how are they to know what to test for if that information is not being disclosed, or if they don't even know a SuperFund site is there. So that kind of, sums up how it applies to drinking water. But in short, there's more than what meets the eye. So just because your municipal report, your CCR, Consumer Confidence Report, Water Quality Report, whatever you want to call it, comes back and says no violations, water's good to go, there's some stuff that you have to read between the lines. So things to consider, where the source water is located, what are some of the SuperFund sites that might be in the nearby distance of your source water. So definitely reach out to one of our water nerds. You can chat us on our website, hydroviv.com, and you can use our live chat feature, or you can email us at hello@hydroviv.com, and we can kind of tell you what you need to look out for in terms of if there's a SuperFund site nearby, or any other questions you have about the SuperFund process. So again, chat us, hello@hydroviv.com. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes, I'll just close that and log off. Looks like we had a bunch of people join, so that's great. So have a good Wednesday. I'm trying to log out here. All right, bye.